My name is Eleanor Whitfield. I'm 31 years old, and I spent my entire childhood being called Grandpa's charity case. Not behind my back, to my face, at Christmas dinners, at birthday parties, in front of cousins who laughed along because that's what you do when your aunt sets the tone for the room. 3 weeks ago, I sat in a courtroom in a gray blazer I'd bought specifically for the occasion, and I listened to a solicitor read my grandfather's will out loud to the entire family. I watched my mother's face change color 4 times in the space of 11 minutes. But before I tell you what was in that will, you need to understand what it cost me to sit in that room and stay quiet for 28 years. Welcome back. If you're new here, this is where ordinary people survive extraordinary family cruelty and come out the other side with their dignity intact. If you've ever been the family scapegoat, the one everyone blamed and nobody defended, this story's for you. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, because what happened in that courtroom is going to stay with you. Let me take you back. Bristol, England, a semi-detached house on a quiet street where everyone knew everyone else's business whether they wanted to or not. My father, Gerald, was the youngest of 3 children. My grandfather, Arthur Whitfield, had built a modest but successful chain of hardware shops across the West Country, the kind of quiet wealth that doesn't announce itself with flashy cars but shows up in property deeds and pension funds. My mother, Patricia, married into that name and spent the next 3 decades making sure everyone remembered it. I was born when my parents were still young, still finding their footing, and money was tight for the first few years of my life. My grandfather helped. He paid for my school shoes one winter. He covered a dental bill when I was 7. He gave my parents a loan to fix the boiler the year I turned 9, a loan they never fully repaid and never intended to. That was the origin of it. That was where the label started. My mother never let me forget it. Every family gathering, every Sunday roast, every birthday, there would be a moment, always casual, always dressed up as a joke, where she'd remind the table that I was the one who cost Grandpa money. "Well, Eleanor's always been his little charity case, haven't you, love?" she'd say. And everyone would laugh, and I'd smile because that's what you learn to do when you're 8 years old. And the alternative is crying in front of people who are already laughing at you. My younger cousin, Miranda, was the golden one. Her parents had money from the start, private school fees paid without a second thought. Ballet lessons, writing lessons, a car for her 17th birthday. Nobody ever called Miranda a charity case for the private tutoring Grandpa quietly paid for during her GCSEs. That story never made it into the Sunday roast rotation. Funny how memory works when you're the one writing the family narrative. I want to be clear about something before I go further. My grandfather never once made me feel like a charity case, not once in 28 years. He was the only person in that family who looked at me like I was simply his granddaughter, full stop, no asterisk attached. He taught me to read a balance sheet before I was 12. He let me sit in his study on Sunday afternoons while he went through invoices, and he'd explain what each column meant, patient in a way my own parents never were. He called me his sharpest little accountant and meant it as the highest compliment he had. My mother resented that closeness more than she ever admitted out loud. She resented that Grandpa Arthur seemed to see something in me that he didn't see in Miranda or in her own attempts to charm him. So she did what people like my mother do when they can't compete for someone's affection. She rewrote the story so that whatever attention I received wasn't love. It was pity. It was a transaction. It was a burden he carried out of obligation, not choice. By the time I was 18, the label had calcified into something permanent. I wasn't Eleanor at family events anymore. I was the one Grandpa looks after. I got into university on a partial scholarship and a part-time job stacking shelves. And when I told my family at Christmas dinner, my mother's exact words were, "Well, at least you won't need Grandpa's charity for that one, will you?" My father said nothing. My father never said anything. Silence was his contribution to the family economy, and it cost him nothing while it cost me everything. I studied law, not because of some dramatic revenge fantasy, not back then anyway, but because numbers and contracts made sense to me in a way that people rarely did. I qualified as a solicitor at 26, specializing in commercial and probate law, the kind of work that involves reading wills, trusts, and estate documents for a living. I want you to remember that detail. It matters later. My grandfather died in March, 4 months before that courtroom morning. He was 83. I sat with him in the hospice during his final week, reading him the racing results from the newspaper because it was the only thing that still made him smile. My mother visited twice, Miranda visited once for 11 minutes and spent most of it on her phone in the corridor. Nobody in my family sat with him the way I did. Nobody held his hand at 4 in the morning when the pain medication wasn't quite enough. I did that because I loved him, not because I expected anything in return. I want that understood clearly before I tell you what happened next. The funeral was at St. Mary's, the church he'd attended every Sunday for 60 years. My mother wore black and cried beautifully, the kind of grief that photographs well. Afterward, at the wake, standing by the sandwich table with a cup of tea I never drank, my Aunt Susan leaned toward me and said, loud enough for 3 other relatives to hear, "Well, Eleanor, I suppose the gravy train's finally stopped, hasn't it?" Everyone within earshot laughed, that same practiced laugh I'd been hearing my entire life. I set my teacup down on the table very carefully, and I said nothing. I had learned by then that silence was not weakness. Silence was simply patience wearing a different coat. The solicitor's letter arrived 9 days after the funeral. Cream envelope, embossed letterhead, the kind of formal correspondence that makes your stomach tighten before you've even opened it. Whitcomb and Associates requesting the presence of the immediate family at their offices in Clifton for the formal reading of Arthur Whitfield's last will and testament. My mother rang me within the hour, her voice bright in a way that made my skin crawl. "Well, Eleanor, I do hope you'll be there. Not that it changes much for you, I imagine, but it's only right you come and support the family." Support the family? As if I hadn't been the only member of that family sitting bedside at 4 in the morning, while everyone else slept soundly in their own homes. I told her I'd be there. I didn't tell her why I wasn't worried. In the 2 weeks before the reading, the family group chat, one I'd been quietly muted in for years but never removed from, lit up with speculation. My mother was certain the bulk of the estate would go to my father and his siblings, split evenly, with the hardware shops likely sold and divided. Aunt Susan wanted to know if the Clifton house would be kept in the family or auctioned. Miranda, 24 and freshly graduated with a media studies degree she'd never used, asked outright whether Grandpa had sorted anything for her, given she was, in her words, basically his favorite. Nobody asked what I thought. Nobody asked if I wanted anything at all. That absence told me more about how they saw me than any insult ever had. I wasn't even considered a variable in their calculations. I was a footnote they assumed had already been accounted for, dismissed, settled long before the will was ever drafted. What none of them knew was that 18 months before he died, my grandfather had asked me, specifically me, to help him restructure his estate. Not as his granddaughter offering advice at the kitchen table, but professionally, in my capacity as a solicitor specializing in probate law. He'd sat across from me in his study, the same study where he'd once taught me to read a balance sheet, and he'd said, "Eleanor, I want this done properly. I want it done so nobody can argue with it after I'm gone." I helped him find an independent solicitor, someone with no connection to our family, precisely so that no one could later claim I'd influenced the outcome. I reviewed the language with him as a professional courtesy, checked the trust structures made sense, made sure every clause was airtight. But the decisions, every single one of them, were entirely his. He told me one thing during those months that I carried with me like a stone in my pocket. He said, "They call you the charity case, don't they? I've heard your mother, I've heard your aunt." I didn't answer him. I didn't need to. He looked at me for a long moment and said, "Let them keep calling you that a little while longer. It'll make the truth land harder when it finally does." I didn't fully understand what he meant until I was sitting in that solicitor's office in Clifton gray blazer, hands folded in my lap, watching my mother check her watch and whisper to Aunt Susan about whether they'd be finished in time for lunch. The solicitor, a measured woman named Miss Whitcomb, opened a leather folder and cleared her throat. And the room went quiet the way rooms only go quiet when money is about to change hands. Ms. Whitcomb began with the formalities. She confirmed the date of the will, the witnesses present at its signing, the fact that it had been drafted and updated 18 months prior to my grandfather's death. My mother shifted in her seat, impatient, the way she always got when a conversation didn't move quickly toward the part that concerned her directly. Aunt Susan checked her phone under the table. Miranda sat beside her mother, legs crossed, already looking bored. The first section was straightforward, small, sentimental bequests. My grandfather's pocket watch to my father, his collection of first edition railway history books to Uncle David, a modest sum, £2,000 each, to a handful of old friends from his church and his darts league. My mother received his late wife's jewelry, the pieces that had belonged to my grandmother, which seemed to please her briefly. Before Ms. Whitcomb moved on to the next clause, then came the hardware shops. 7 locations across the West Country, valued, Ms. Whitcomb noted, at approximately £3.2 million combined, including the property, stock, and goodwill. My mother's posture straightened. This was the part everyone had been waiting for. The business, Ms. Whitcomb read, including all associated properties, assets, and holding accounts, is to be placed into a managed trust. She paused, the way professionals pause when they know the next sentence is going to matter. The trust is to be overseen by an appointed trustee, with income distributed annually to Gerald and Patricia Whitfield for the remainder of their natural lives at a fixed percentage determined by the trustee, with the principal itself protected and non-transferable. My mother blinked. I'm sorry, protected from whom? Ms. Whitcomb didn't look up from the document. The principal cannot be sold, borrowed against, or liquidated by the beneficiaries. Only the annual income distribution is available to Gerald and Patricia. Upon their passing, the trust passes in full to the named successor trustee. I watched my mother's face change for the first time. Not anger yet. Confusion. The particular confusion of someone who has spent 3 decades assuming a number was theirs, only to discover it was never fully in their hands to begin with. And who, my mother asked, her voice tightening, is the trustee? Ms. Whitcomb turned a page. The appointed trustee and the named successor beneficiary of the full trust upon Gerald and Patricia's passing is their daughter, Eleanor Margaret Whitfield. The room did not go silent so much as it seemed to lose air entirely. Aunt Susan's phone slipped from her hand and landed face down on the carpet. Miranda actually laughed, a short, disbelieving bark of a sound before catching herself. My mother turned in her seat and looked at me the way you look at something that has changed shape in front of you without your permission. That's not, she started, then stopped, then started again. There must be some mistake. Eleanor's never had anything to do with the business. She's never even worked there. Ms. Whitcomb glanced up, calm, unbothered, the way people are when they've read enough wills to know exactly how this moment always unfolds. Mr. Whitfield was quite specific about his reasoning. If you'd like, I can read the accompanying letter he left with the will. He asked that it be read aloud, in full, in the presence of the family before any questions were taken. My mother's mouth opened. Nothing came out. I sat very still, hands folded in my lap, and I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not yet. Just quiet. The same quiet I'd been carrying since that day by the sandwich table at the wake. Miss Whitcomb reached into the folder and pulled out a single handwritten page. My grandfather's handwriting, the same handwriting I'd watched fill ledger after ledger on those Sunday afternoons in his study. Shall I continue? She asked the room, though she wasn't really asking permission. She was simply being polite before she read my grandfather's last words to a family that had spent 28 years calling me his charity case. Ms. Whitcomb cleared her throat and began to read. And my grandfather's voice filled that room one final time, steady and unhurried, exactly the way he used to speak on those Sunday afternoons. To my family gathered here today, I imagine some of you are surprised. I imagine some of you are angry. I've had 18 months to think about how to say this, and I've decided the kindest thing I can do is simply tell the truth, the way I always tried to teach Eleanor to read a ledger. Numbers don't lie. People do. My mother's hand had crept up to cover her mouth. I kept my eyes on Ms. Whitcomb, on the page, on my grandfather's handwriting, because I couldn't yet bring myself to look at my mother's face. For 28 years, I watched my family call my granddaughter a charity case. I heard it at Christmas, I heard it at birthdays, I heard it at my own wife's funeral, when Patricia made a joke about Eleanor's shoes being the only inheritance she'd ever see. I said nothing at the time because I believed, foolishly, that it would stop on its own. It did not stop. It got worse. And the cruelest part was that Eleanor never once complained to me about it. Not once in 28 years did she ask me for anything, or use what closeness we had to gain favor, or speak a single word against the family that mocked her. She simply kept showing up. She sat with me every week for the last 3 years of my life while others visited when convenient. She held my hand in that hospice room at 4 in the morning more times than I can count, and she never once mentioned that anyone owed her anything for it. Aunt Susan had gone very pale. Miranda was staring at the carpet. I helped Eleanor when she was young because her parents needed help, and I have never regretted a single penny of it. What I regret is that my help became a weapon used against a child who did nothing but grow up decent in a family that rewarded cruelty with laughter. I built this business over 50 years. I will not hand it to people who cannot tell the difference between kindness and debt. Gerald and Patricia will want for nothing. The income from this trust will keep them comfortable for the rest of their lives. But the business itself, the thing I built with my own hands, will pass to the one person in this family who never once treated love like a ledger to be balanced. Eleanor, if you're listening to this being read, I want you to know something I should have told you more often while I was alive. You were never my charity case. You were simply the only one who ever visited me without checking what was in it for you first. Look after the business the way you looked after me. That's all I ask. Ms. Whitcomb folded the letter and set it down on the table. Nobody spoke. Somewhere outside the window, a bus pulled away from a stop. Ordinary sounds from an ordinary street, entirely indifferent to what had just happened inside that room. My mother turned to me slowly. Her eyes were wet, but I couldn't tell yet whether it was grief or fury. "Eleanor," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "did you know about this?" I looked at my mother, and for the first time in 28 years, I let myself take my time before answering her. "I knew he'd restructured the estate," I said. "I helped him find an independent solicitor because he wanted it done properly, and because he wanted to make sure nobody could ever say I'd influenced the outcome. I never once asked him for anything, Mum, not a penny, not a promise. I sat with him because he was my grandfather and I loved him. What he chose to write in that letter is not something I asked for, and it's not something I owe you an apology for." Aunt Susan found her voice first, sharp and brittle. "This is absurd. She's manipulated a dying old man. We should contest this." Ms. Whitcomb answered before I had to. "You're welcome to seek independent legal advice, of course. But I'd note that Mr. Whitfield used an entirely separate solicitor from Eleanor's firm, that he was assessed as having full mental capacity at the time of drafting, with a doctor's letter on file confirming as much, and that the will explicitly states his reasoning in his own handwriting, witnessed and notarized. Any challenge would need to overturn all three of those facts simultaneously." She said it plainly, without malice, the way you read a bank statement to someone who's overdrawn. Aunt Susan didn't say anything else. My mother didn't speak again during the meeting. She sat very still, staring at the folder in front of her, and I watched 28 years of a story she told herself collapse quietly in real time. Nobody clapped, nobody cried the way they do in films. It was just a small, cold room in Clifton and a family finally hearing, out loud, the thing they'd refused to see for almost 3 decades. I want to be honest with you about what happened after. This wasn't a fairy tale ending. My mother didn't apologize that day, or the next week, or the month after. Aunt Susan still hasn't spoken to me since. Miranda sent one text 3 weeks later asking if I could sort her out with a job at one of the shops. I didn't reply. Some silences answered themselves. But my father called me 6 weeks later on a Tuesday evening, and for the first time in my adult life, he didn't stay quiet. He said, "I should have said something all those years. I'm sorry I never did. It wasn't everything. It wasn't enough to undo 28 Christmases, but it was honest. And honest was more than I had had from him in 3 decades, so I let it be enough for now. I run the business properly these days, 7 shops, 62 employees, and a trust that keeps my parents comfortable whether they ever forgive me or not. Because that was never the point. My grandfather didn't leave me a company. He left me proof that somebody had been watching the whole time and had seen exactly who I was, even when nobody else bothered to look. If your family ever made you feel like your love came with a price tag, I want you to hear this. Being kind isn't a debt you owe. It's not currency, and it never was. Someone is always watching, even when you think no one sees you. Share this with someone who needs to hear that today. Drop a comment if this reminded you of your own family, and I'll see you in the next one.